Hi folks, we're going to go back to If Thou Be series, and what we're going to do, we're going to look at something that took place in the garden with Adam and Eve. And I'd like for you to go with me to Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 2. And one of the things that's real interesting here is that whenever Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, he had to go back to his original playbook. Then it started with Adam and Eve in the garden. And he went back to that playbook to find out how he tricked Adam and Eve and how he deceived them, thinking that he could do the same thing with Jesus. The problem was Jesus knew what was going on, and he couldn't do that. That suggests that there's an important key here that we need to understand. We need to know what's going on so that he can't deceive us, okay? So Genesis chapter 2, verse number 15 through 17. Genesis 2, verses 15 through 17. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Now, I want you to notice they were created. Adam was created, formed out of the dust of the ground. And God gave him this garden. He said, of all the trees here, you can eat the fruit of them. But he said, there's one tree that I don't want you to eat of, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Real interesting, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Actually, one translation has said it this way, it's the tree of blessing and calamity. Blessing and calamity. He said, don't eat of that tree. That's the only thing that he told him not to do. Don't eat of that tree. Then in verse number 25, and it's talking about, this is after he had taken a rib out of Adam and formed Eve from that rib. And verse number 25, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So there's something interesting here. In the garden, everything was perfect. In the garden, everything was perfect. They had God's breath on the inside of them. God's breath was there, inside of him. He breathed into Adam. Then he took the rib out of Adam and he formed Eve. Then he said, I'm going to give you the authority. Told Adam this, I'm going to give you the authority of everything above the earth, on the earth, and under the earth. He said, you're having that authority. That made the enemy mad because the devil used to be, was Lucifer, who was a created being. And Lucifer fell because of his pride, because of the love of money is the reason that he fell. And God booted him out of heaven. So God's continued dream, his plan was to create man so he could have fellowship with man. And so he formed Adam, gave him the authority over the earth, over in heaven, given everything in the heavens, in the earth, and under the earth. And then he set him in this garden. He said, all of this is yours. Don't eat of that tree. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in that tree, in that garden. Verse number 17, he says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. In the day that thou eatest of it, thou shalt surely die. The word surely here is translated, thou shalt die. Because the translators didn't want to use the word die twice, they used you shall surely die. The first die was talking about spiritual death. The second die was talking about physical death. So basically what happened is, what was taking place is that God told Adam, he said, if you eat of this tree, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die spiritually first, and that will lead to you dying physically second. So he said, don't eat of that. He said, I want to have fellowship with you. Everything was perfect. He gave him, he said, you're a free moral agent. I'm going to give you the right to choose either to eat of that or not to eat of it. Then it went over to he created Eve, and the enemy, whenever he heard that the authority that he had originally had was given to somebody that's made out of the dust of the ground, can you imagine? And God gave Adam that authority, and then he created Eve. And so the enemy went to the weakest part of the two. The wife is the weaker vessel, okay? I'm not saying she's not smarter than the man she may be, and more than likely is in many, many cases. But it's the weaker vessel. And he went to the weaker vessel and he said, let me show you something that really sparkles. This will create all of your need. This right here will eliminate everything that God said you can't have. This right here will take care of that. And in verse number 7, actually let's just look at verse number 1 of chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Thou shalt not eat of the tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And then the serpent said, or the devil said this, And the serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die. You won't die spiritually. You won't die physically. For God knows that in the day that you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now this is interesting. The enemy told them, he said, if you'll eat of this, the reason that God doesn't want you to eat of that is because once you eat of that, you will know good and evil. Time out just a second. Why would they want to know evil? It doesn't make sense. Why do you and I, we see all the stuff going on in our world. Do you want to see that? No. Do you want to see them beheading Christians? No. Do you want to see them torturing Christians? Do you want to see them torturing people? No. There's two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You and I have the right, and we'll talk about this later, but we have the right. We can eat of the tree of life for the rest of our life. But most of the time we try to go back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to get our assurance, our acceptance. We'll talk about that as well. In verse number 6, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, or Vic's translation, it had a sparkle to it. Diamonds is a woman's best friend. It has a sparkle to it. I'm not trying to connect the tree and diamonds, but see, sometimes we look at the sparkle, but we don't look back behind the sparkle. And the tree was be desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. It was going to make them wise. Wait a minute. They already were wise. Don't you want to be like God in essence? Then if you'll do this. Everybody wants to be like God. They already were. They were created in his image, in his likeness. Everything that God was on the inside of them. Everything. And yet the sparkle, if you allow, The sparkle of the enemy said, hey, Eve, look at this sparkle. Look at this flash. Isn't that pretty? Don't you want that? Well, yeah, let's do that. But it'll make us wise, and we'll know good and evil both. They didn't need to know evil. They wouldn't have had to know evil. Listen, if they hadn't have done that, you and I wouldn't know evil today. Now, watch what happened. Verse number 7, and the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Their eyes were opened, and they knew they were naked. In verse number 25, and he said, they were both naked, but they were not ashamed. Here in verse number 7, the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God said unto Adam, where are you? And he said, I heard your voice, and I was in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. Now, here's something that's really interesting. I think we ought to pay a little bit of attention to this. Before the enemy challenged them, before the enemy challenged their identity, there was no fear and there was no shame. The moment that they fell for the challenge, don't you want to be like God? They already were like God. They didn't need to do something else. They were already like God. But the sparkle, if you will, attracted them, and they didn't look behind the sparkle to see what was really going on. It's the way a lot of people are today. They don't look behind the sparkle of things to see what's promoting the sparkle, what's pushing it. Excuse me for being plain and blunt, but that's what happens in prostitution. That's what happens in thievery. That's what happens in all of these areas that the enemy is promoting. There's a sparkle at the front, but you never see what's going on behind it unless you know. Listen, the loud and boisterous, they say the right things, but what's behind it? What's the motive behind it? And they hid themselves. And he said the reason that they hid themselves was because they were afraid. They weren't ashamed and they weren't afraid before the fall. After the fall, they were afraid and they were ashamed. They hid behind fig leaves. Interesting. They hid behind fig leaves. When that didn't work, they hid behind the trees. And when that didn't work, and it never does, God said, why are you hiding there? They were afraid and they were ashamed. What were they afraid of? They were afraid of being rejected by the Father, by God himself. And that fear fueled their shame, and they went and hid. You know what the problem of shame is? Whenever you're ashamed, you'll run, you'll hide, because you don't want anybody to know. We'll run and hide. The problem with that is wherever you go to hide, there you are. We'll pick up here again in the next session. Very interesting. The power of shame, and it's been broken, but it's about our identity. And I want to ask you, there's 3 questions I want to ask. Was there fear? Was there fear before Adam and Eve sinned? No. Was there shame before Adam and Eve sinned? No. When did fear and shame come into the earth? After they sinned. What is it that causes man to go hide? The fear of being rejected by their Father. Thank you very much. We'll pick up right here in the next session.